Welcome to this webinar on the Israel Anti-Boycott Act Explained with Laura Friedman, the Executive Director of Foundations for Middle East Peace. My name is May Cannon. I'm the Executive Director of Churches for Middle East Peace. We're glad that you're joining us today. We'll be spending the next hour talking about this Israel Anti-Boycott Act, and we're very honored to have Laura Friedman with us. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you, May. It's a pleasure to be here.
And Shana Tova, Happy New Year to you.
Thank you very much.
Yes, good that we can talk about this today. Maybe I'll give a little bit of your background before you could start us off with an introduction. Before you were with Foundations for Middle East Peace, Laura served as the Director of Policy and Government Relations for Americans for Peace Now. I didn't know until I read your bio in preparation for this, Laura, that you were formerly a Foreign Service officer.
Yep.
Yeah, so Laura comes to us with a broad background. She is an expert, not only here in Washington, D.C., but is renowned and has spoken before the United Nations, has written numerous articles analyzing specific policies. But we're really glad that you can help us deconstruct what's happening in U.S. Congress as it relates to the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. So thanks for being here with us today.
My pleasure. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, why don't you get us started? So what is this act? I mean, let's maybe start there, and then we could talk from where it comes from.
Sure. So what we're looking at today is legislation in the House and the Senate with a large number of co-sponsors, bipartisan in both the House and the Senate, which ostensibly is about pushing back against boycotts of Israel. In the context of this legislation, it's boycotts of Israel organized and pushed by governments or governmental organizations, so specifically the EU and the UN are referenced in this bill. And this is sort of, this is just the latest iteration in a series of pieces of legislation we've had that ostensibly are about fighting BDS, but in truth are first and foremost about legalizing occupation, making support for occupation and settlements US policy, and secondly, about curbing free speech in terms of what is legal activism against Israel and Israeli policies.
So I'm going to ask you to deconstruct some terms that we're certainly familiar with working on this, but some people watching might not be. So you said that this is a bill to respond to BDS. Tell us what BDS is. Sure.
I mean, look, people should go online and research for themselves. I don't want to go too far in characterizing it. BDS is the sort of catch-all term. It comes from the BDS movement, but it's gone far beyond that. B stands for boycott, D stands for divestment, S stands for sanctions, and it is so it is the trend in activism which says everything we've tried over all the years since occupation started in '67 has failed to change Israeli policy, and now we need to focus on coercive measures that we as activists can take. There are people who would say this isn't just about the occupation that started in '67, this is actually about Israeli policies that date to '48. And that's part of the debate within the activist community. Is this targeting Israel? Is this targeting occupation? Is the end goal an end to occupation? Is the end goal the end to Israel? Or is the end goal of one state, a secular binational? None of those things are resolved, but BDS is now the catch-all term used both by supporters and by opponents to describe any sort of activism that involves boycotts, divestments, or sanctions.
Okay. So this legislation called the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, I mean, when I first heard about it, it was with some people sending me notes and saying that this could criminalize individuals and make them pay thousands of dollars or even more and spend time in jail. Like, what's that all about? You mentioned that this legislation specifically talks about corporations or the EU or the UN government. So why are people why are people so upset about this? What's the big deal?
So first, just to take a step back, as I said, this is the latest in a long. We've had an ongoing campaign, both at the state and local level, state and the federal level, to enact laws that make it that obstruct the ability of activists to use boycotts, divestment, and sanctions as a tool of activism. We've already had 2 laws passed under President Obama that were related to trade policy, which seems very esoteric. Who cares about trade policy? But in both of those trade bills, there was language in there that basically made it U.S. policy to defend and promote settlements and occupation and defend them against pressure in the form of boycott or sanctions, and to effectively say that it is illegitimate to use boycotts against Israel as an activist measure. There's 2 problems with that. One is that conflating Israel and occupation, Israel and the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, very problematic. It's contrary to international law, contrary to U.S. policy since the beginning of the occupation. And also is the problem of free speech in the Constitution, because boycotts are constitutionally protected free speech. And essentially we have an effort here to create what I think people would try to call a free speech exception when it comes to Israel. This piece of legislation that is in front of Congress now is in many ways the most egregious of all those. The ones that are happening at the state level focus on the ability of people to compete for contracts, and basically saying you have to give up free speech in order to compete for contracts. That's highly problematic and probably will not survive court challenge. And some of those are about divesting state pension funds and whatnot from companies that allegedly boycott Israel, but really what they mean is they won't invest in settlements. But again, I don't think that's a much smaller scale issue. What we're seeing here is legislation that says, in effect, it's taking existing legislation that bans U.S. persons from buying into the Arab League boycott of Israel, which is long-standing legislation, and it expands that to essentially prohibit U.S. persons, that's companies, but it also means individuals, people like me, from doing anything to promote or abide by boycotts of Israel or the settlements or occupation, territories under Israel's control that are supported, called for by the EU or the UN. So again, that's problematic, first and foremost on the conflation piece of it, because it is saying that boycotting settlements is exactly the same as boycotting Israel. That is a massive shift in US policy. And then it's, even if you accept that shift, which I don't, it's saying that boycotts are not protected free speech. There are those who will say, what is the problem? This has been our policy for decades in terms of challenging the Arab League boycott of Israel. Why is this a problem? And the answer is, this is like, I had something a while ago, I said something was like comparing apples and orangutans. It's not even apples and oranges. The Arab League boycott of Israel is it is the definition of a coercive boycott, which is to say, U.S. companies, U.S. individuals were essentially told under this boycott, if you don't obey the rules of this boycott, you will face problems doing business elsewhere. You will face a cost. That is a coercive boycott. It's saying you're not acting out of your free speech and your political views. You actually have to become tools of the Arab League's foreign policy and use and implement their views in order to do business. That's a coercive boycott. What this legislation is doing is saying that me, as a U.S. person, and I wrote an article about this, as a U.S. person who has long argued that settlements are not the same as Israel and has long pushed the UN and the EU and other governments, everybody, to say, I draw the green line, I support Israel, but I won't do business in settlements. And now the EU and the UN are very clearly doing that. If I continue to espouse that view and link my views in support of the EU or the UN and their efforts, I would be, under this legislation, there's no question, you can read the language, it's very clear, I would be, potentially vulnerable for up to 20 years in jail and up to $1 million in fines. So for folks who say this isn't a free speech issue for Americans, it's only about corporate business behavior, either they haven't read the legislation, or they don't understand legislation, or they're lying. Those are your 3 options.
Well, and part of what we're trying to do in this conversation is to seek to understand it. And so thank you for helping to parse and break it down for us. And so I'm going to ask some questions that may seem a little redundant, but I just want to try to be sure that we're clear for people who might not be living in this world to the degree that you are. So I've heard you say several times that one of the main problems with the Israel anti-boycott legislation is the conflation of settlements and Israel proper. So the settlements in the West Bank, Israelis who are living on land designated related to the Palestinians. So how does this legislation conflate? Like, can you break that down for us a little bit?
Sure, I'm staring at my other screen so I can pull up. I don't have it in front of me. I would first of all refer people to the article that I wrote on this, because I'm a former State Department wonk, which means that when I write, I tend to give lots of references so you can, don't believe me, read for yourself. This, folks, is not rocket science. The legislation is out there. It is not long. You should read it for yourself, because the plain English reading of it, this is not hard. This legislation, like much of the legislation that we've seen, the two trade bills, the legislation at the state level, it essentially redefines boycotts of Israel to include boycotts of Israel and Israeli-controlled territories, or territories are under Israel's control, or some such formula, which is a way of saying, for the purposes of this law, we do not recognize any distinction between sovereign Israel within the recognized, not borders, but recognized territory recognized by the international community as sovereign Israel. This legislation says there's no difference for the purpose of this law between that and the territories that are under Israel's control since 1967, the vast majority of which are not even considered by Israel to be sovereign Israeli territory. So Israel annexed East Jerusalem and the Golan, but all of the rest of the West Bank and Gaza are not considered to be sovereign Israeli territory, even under Israeli law. But we're going to have U.S. law that goes one better and says, it's okay, we'll go ahead and treat it as if it's sovereign Israeli territory, because that's, you know, we don't want to punish settlements. Right. So that's what we mean when we talk about conflation. We're conflating Israel and settlements, saying that they're all one, or erasing the green line, or extending U.S. support and protection to settlements. This is all the same thing.
That's really helpful. And for those who might not be supportive of BDS, or who might have different views on BDS, I mean, Churches for Middle East Peace, for example, we are neutral on the issue of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. We have some groups who fully support BDS. We have some groups that support only the boycotting of settlement products. And we have some groups that are very against it and feel like it's not the most effective nonviolent tool to engage. So. Right. As we're talking about this legislation and how it's problematic, how would you speak to people who have different views on whether or not BDS is a good thing? Like, why would this bill be a problem, even if we don't think BDS is, you know, the best way to actively engage?
Look, the starting point is that you should oppose this bill. Well, I mean, I'm not a lobbyist. I'm not telling you to do late weighing in. You should be concerned by this bill, even if you don't care at all about Israel-Palestine. If you have no stake on Israel-Palestine, but as an American, you care about progressive values, free speech, you should be concerned about this. The ACLU has come out strongly on this bill, not because the ACLU cares at all about BDS. They don't, I believe, have any position on BDS. And I can't remember any context in which the ACLU, no, I can't remember any time, has come out on anything on Israel-Palestine. They are coming out on it because this is a free speech issue. This and what is happening at the state level, you start looking at what I call this illiberal creep into U.S. politics. What we are seeing in the Israeli context, where you say, don't worry about international law, don't even worry about your own laws, because under Israeli law, a lot of what's happening in the West Bank is illegal. Don't worry about any of that. We are in charge, we are stronger, right makes right, we're going to do this. And effectively, when people say, well, I don't like BDS, so I don't want to hear about the free speech stuff. They're saying that, okay, I said to someone yesterday, if you think you have principles, if you hold principles about free speech and civil liberties, but you're willing to buy into this one anyway, you need to examine whether you really do hold principles or whether you just have things that you tell yourself to make you feel good about yourself, which are completely malleable when it's necessary. I will say that I personally do not support BDS against Israel. I don't think it is the most effective method to challenge Israeli policy. For people whose goal is genuinely to challenge Israeli policy and get the policies of occupation to change, I think the most effective way is to focus your activism on settlements and occupation. I think it's incredibly effective. You know, how do I know it's effective? Well, we have things like this law. The legislation that we've been seeing for the past few years is not in response to BDS against Israel, which has not had a lot of impact. It's in response to re-energized, or maybe for the first time, as the peace process has now fallen apart and is not credible, we've seen this re-energized effort to focus on settlements and occupation and differentiation between Israel and settlements. This is Israel, this is not. And you see this almost exaggerated, hysterical response in which you have this kind of legislation, which shows me that this kind of focused activism is extremely effective. It's an arbitrary distinction between Israel and settlements. Israeli government is behind the settlements. And activists who say that, they're absolutely right. My goal here is impact. If your goal is just basically to say, I'm frustrated, I want to punch the Israeli government in the face, then I'm probably not going to be able to convince you that BDS against Israel is not the best idea, and we're going to disagree. But I will say that while I do not support BDS against Israel, I will go to the mat for the right of an American to engage in constitutionally protected free speech in challenging whatever it is they want to challenge, because there is no such thing as a free speech exception. And I will not, as someone who's spent most of my career fighting for a progressive, secure Israel, I will not stand by quietly while people use the pretext of supporting Israel to erode my free speech as an American. The free speech of people that I may disagree with, but whose absolute right to free speech, I will not see it sacrificed and see Israel be used as the excuse to sacrifice it. So whether you support it or not, you should be concerned about this bill.
Right. And it seems like there's actually a lot of legislators who would agree with you. I mean, we've seen not only has this legislation received a lot of national attention, but there have been some pretty significant people in Congress who've removed their support. So could you tell us what things have been like since the bills were introduced and kind of what the reaction's been since then, from Gillibrand to, you know, I know Representative Adam Smith, at least at one point in a town hall, said he was going to pull his support. Last I heard, he had not formally yet, but, you know, can you tell us a bit about what this has looked like within Congress?
So, and for everybody who's watching, this is something that the grassroots really should pay close attention to. This, you know, I've been sort of screaming hair on fire about this legislation in its various forms for a few years, and have, I'll be honest, really failed to capture anyone's attention. It's been tremendously frustrating, state and local, state and federal. And there have been successes at the state level in pushing back on this. And those successes have been when the grassroots, the local grassroots has risen up and said, whoa, what are you doing? In this case, what happened is the grassroots rose up in a way, you know, this wasn't organized, there was no single force behind it. I watched it with just joy and astonishment, seeing the grassroots rise up and say, holy crap, this will not stand. And that grassroots went far beyond the Israel-Palestine grassroots to the grassroots that says this is a key moment for civil rights, civil liberties, free speech in this country. We cannot allow this to just pass. And we saw this in town halls. And you see what happens when a member of Congress who self-identifies as a progressive is challenged in a town hall meeting on this legislation. They have to respond. It's very awkward. I mean, if you want to give them credit, it forces of you know, good intentions. It forces members of Congress who maybe were not aware of what they had signed on to, which I think is often the case. They see BDS, they think, well, this is consensus, completely innocuous, everybody agrees, no problem, and they sign. I think a lot of members, you know, this is a teachable moment, and their constituents have basically said, you will learn. You will learn to not sign on to these things instantly without asking questions, because this is highly problematic. And the videos of members being challenged at town halls, I've never seen anything like it. At the same time, you still have a lot of members who are saying, no, you're wrong, it's not a problem. The ACLU was wrong. I think it's fascinating watching progressive members of Congress, you know, do somersaults trying to find ways to avoid the ACLU or to discredit the ACLU on this. And you have bigger problems. Look, the Anti-Defamation League, the head of the Anti-Defamation League co-signed an op-ed a few days ago saying the ACLU and all those activists are wrong. It's not a free speech problem. It defies credulity that people are writing this. Again, I would encourage people, you know, don't just listen to me, don't just listen to anybody else. Get online, look at the bill, read it for yourself. It's very clear what this legislation does. If you are still supporting it, It means that either you don't understand it and you have an obligation as members of Congress to understand it, so I'd say, or you've decided you don't care and you're going to support it anyway, or you actively do support a free speech exception. And, you know, I was raised in a progressive Jewish family. I vividly remember a conversation with my mother when I was a kid, when she was explaining to me why we, as the American Jewish community, support the right of the Ku Klux Klan to march. And she was very clear. We as Jews understand that if free speech is not protected for everybody, it's protected for nobody. I fear that many folks have forgotten that lesson.
Yes, well, and I think that's a challenging word, but a good one. So in just a few minutes, we're going to open it up for some questions. We've had several come through so far. Before we do go to questions, what's the current status of these proposals in the Senate and in the House? You know, we know that some key members have withdrawn their support, but what we've heard is if there are edits to the, to the bills, then they'll be approved. You know, where do things stand right now and kind of what's happening next?
Look, it's still, AIPAC put out a new action alert yesterday urging people to contact their members of Congress and get them to co-sign it, co-sponsor it with, you know, this action alert, which I tweeted. I took a picture of it and tweeted. You can see it for yourself, laying out once again arguments that simply do not pass the laugh test on why this is not a problem. I mean, essentially nobody is actually going to language to explain why I and the ACLU are misreading it. They just keep insisting over and over that no, it's not a problem for free speech. Don't worry about what it says. This is its intent, and it's not a problem for free speech. So they're still pushing it. My expectation after years of working these issues in Washington is that we're going to see some cosmetic changes to the legislation, which will then be used to try to convince, or as cover for members who have expressed concerns to get on board. We will hear people saying, listen, what do you want me to do? I held the line, we made it better. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good, which is a fabulous Washington turn of phrase, which after years of working in Washington, I have come to associate with it as it's usually an introduction to someone saying something which is morally indefensible or utterly at odds with the morals and principles they say that they support. So anytime someone says, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, it's sort of like when someone says, with all due respect, odds are the next thing they say is not going to be respectful. So my expectation is we should watch out for amendments that it's going to be cosmetic. There's no way to amend this into better legislation. If someone says, well, we've amended it and we've clarified even further that this conflation of Israel and the settlements doesn't change U.S. policy, well, that's crap. I mean, if you're making it U.S. policy to protect the settlements, you're changing U.S. policy, and no, it's called Article of Construction, where you actually like clarify something like, you know, it's like when Congress has a piece of legislation more or less saying that we want regime change in Iran, but saying, by the way, none of this is an authorization of military force. You know, it's not particularly convincing. But even if you got the conflation out of it, and this goes back to the BDS question, even if they flat out removed the conflation part, which by the way would make this, in terms of concrete impact, it would make it meaningless, because the argument behind this bill is, oh my God, the EU and the UN are seeking to boycott Israel. We have to stop them. Well, actually, the only thing that this is about is boycotting settlements, because neither the EU nor any EU country nor the UN have ever called for boycotting the state of Israel, right? So if you took the conflation out of this legislation would actually have zero effect, and it would still be problematic because it's still creating a new standard which says there's a free speech exception on boycotts when it comes to Israel, voluntary boycotts. I don't agree when people say we should boycott Israel. It is absolutely their right to call for boycotts of Israel. And it is my job, if I disagree with them, to make the case why they should do otherwise. It is not my job to seek to quash their free speech, to say you can boycott anybody and anything in the world except Israel or except settlements. That's got to be a line. So this cannot be amended to be better legislation. And don't get suckered into that.
Well, we have now more than a dozen questions in front of me, so I'll start throwing them at you if I may. Here's the first one. I can see how the constraints on export-import make free speech on BDS moot, but I don't see how the Act's enforcers could come after me as an individual, question mark.
So it really depends who you are as an individual, and this is why I wrote my article. And I mean, I don't see, if for the average American who says, I boycott settlement goods, or even I boycott Israel, this legislation in itself is not going to put you in jail or make you liable for fines. It does become the first brick in the wall that will become the legislation that does that. And we've seen at the state level other bricks put into place. Bear in mind that as people build this wall of legislation, they don't start from scratch. They start referencing the previous legislation. So if this legislation passes into law, I encourage you to anticipate future legislation that builds on it, that further restricts free speech, that it doesn't talk about defining Israel and settlements, whatever. It'll just reference public law, whatever this becomes, and say, this is settled. This is settled law that these kind of boycotts are illegitimate. We settled it in this legislation that was passed back in 2017, in September, whenever it was. So now all we're doing is logically applying it further, because that was a very narrow goal. And since we've established the principle, it should apply everywhere. If it's wrong to do X here, then it's wrong to do X everywhere. And you all agreed it's wrong to do X, right? So people should be very conscious of that. In terms of whose free speech this hurts, it's not going to be you, the average activist. It will unquestionably, though, potentially affect me and people like me. And I would say that you should pay attention to that. You can say, well, I'm not a leader. I'm not writing op-eds praising the EU for differentiating between settlements and Israel. That's fine. If you don't care about the free speech of the people who are the ones, the sort of key activists shaping this debate and making sure the world knows what's happening, then don't worry. And I guarantee there's a lot of settlers out there and people on the Israeli right who would love to see my life ruined by this. You know, there's no question. If you're not worried about that, I mean, it's sort of like, you know, people not being worried if there's legislation against Black Lives Matter. They say, well, you know, I'm in favor of civil rights and against racial profiling, but I'm not a member of BLM, so it doesn't affect me if they try to legislate against BLM. Okay, if you're comfortable with that argument, then okay. I would again encourage you to examine the principles that you say are behind your activism, the principles and values that shape who you are, and try to figure out how those things fit together. I would suggest that you need to look beyond whether this will affect you personally to how it affects free speech more broadly.
Mm-hmm. And one of the things I've heard you say several times is that people should read the legislation, so we can send them a link to that. And then you've mentioned this article. Where is it published? Where can people find it? We can send it out to our folks as well.
Sure. It's there's been a lot of great stuff written about this. I would encourage you, if you go to our website, fmep.org, there's a link to the article, which is entitled, I think, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act is an act of political persecution, and that's the case study with me. I would also encourage you to look, there's actually a page on the FMEP website under resources, which is entitled Constitutional Resources about the BDS legislation. And that has links to pretty much every major opinion written by the ACLU, by the constitutional, there's a lot of folks who are not Israel-Palestine people who've weighed in on the constitutionality question. The folks who support this legislation cherry pick. They basically have one professor of international law who is one of the, he's a law professor, who has become the guy who rationalizes and justifies all of this legislation. He's helping write the legislation at the state level. But pretty much everybody else who's got law and constitutional expertise disagrees with him, including the guy Eugene Volokh, who's the guy who supports this stuff, Eugene Kantorovich, actually has his column under Eugene Volokh's name in the Volokh Conspiracy on the Washington Post. And Eugene Volokh agrees with me on this. But there you go. www.fmep.org.
Yes, okay, Foundations for Middle East Peace website. And again, we'll send that out to everybody who's signed up to watch this, and we'll make that available as well. Just another question about resources. We had a question come in specifically about state legislation, and if there's a place where there's a map or some place where people could go to find out what's happening on anti-BDS
Sure.
legislation on the state level.
Sure. So there's a number of sources. On the FMEP website, you will find my table. I keep two tables that are constantly updated. One is a table of faux anti-BDS pro-settlement legislation in Congress, and another one is faux anti-BDS legislation pro-settlements bills at the state level. And those are constantly updated. So again, you'll find that under resources at our website. I believe Palestine Legal also has resources and maybe a map. There's different groups that are covering this in different levels. If you get on Google and poke around, you'll find it. But you can certainly start at our website if you want.
That's very helpful. Thank you. The resources, and as she mentioned, Foundation for Middle East Peace's website. So here's a question that's specifically asking you, why do you oppose BDS?
So that's a fair question. As I said before, and I will say that my own position on this has evolved as I have understood BDS better, and as I've gotten to know more and more people who, I'm sorry, they're not anti-Semitic, they're not anti-Israel. Many of them are Jewish. Many of them care deeply about Israel. Many of them are Israeli, who have come to the conclusion that the only thing that is going to change Israeli policy is tangible, concrete activism that cannot be ignored. And so for years, I think the narrative, certainly from my community, was, well, anything related to BDS is by definition anti-Israel, anti-Semitic. I think those talking points are at least a decade out of date. I do not ascribe to them. For me, this is really a tactical question. I believe that focusing on settlements and occupation is the more effective approach. And I am interested not in, my goal is not to just make myself feel better. I understand that a lot of people want to vent frustration, and that's perfectly fair. And they may disagree on me on whether this is tactically the right approach, but I believe that if you focus on settlements and occupation, you send a very clear message to Israelis that cannot be ignored. The evidence that it is effective, because when we first, when I was still at Peace Now, adopted the settlement boycott argument, we got lots of arguments on why we shouldn't do this, starting with Jews don't boycott Jews, and which is hilarious because in Israel, Jews boycott other Jews for every possible reason you can imagine, many of them quite offensive and many of them pretty trivial. But the sort of kicker argument I would always get is very dismissive from journalists, from analysts, people on the Hill was, well, it's not going to work anyway. It won't make any difference. You shouldn't do this because Jews don't boycott Jews in any way. It won't work. Well, obviously it does work, because the impact of people boycotting settlements or insisting on differentiating between Israel and settlements has been a massive international pressure campaign by the Israeli government to stop us from doing it. So don't tell me it doesn't work. The concern that we are at a moment at 50 years of occupation where for the first time the international community will really draw a line and draw the green line at a time when the Israeli government is doing everything possible to erase that green line permanently, is clearly having an effect. And by focusing our activism this way, we send a very clear message, and it may not be a message every activist shares. My message is, I'm not against Israel. I actually care deeply about Israel, and I want Israel to continue to exist in the future as a secure, progressive, democratic state with a Jewish character. And I believe that it cannot do that if it maintains the occupation in perpetuity. And focusing my activism this way, I think, helps bolster those arguments and make clear what my intent is. That is not to say in any way it is illegitimate for people to take another approach. I think it's the wrong approach. I hope I can convince them to adopt mine.
This is a follow-up question to that BDS coaxes Israel to do the right thing and to end the occupation of the Palestinian territories. And it has caused some companies to leave West Bank settlements. So why not support it?
So again, I think here we're having a problem with the terms. BDS coaxing West is, it's funny. So I'm going to use SodaStream as an example. So I was one of the people who, when we found out that SodaStream was operating in the Mishur Adumim industrial zone, which is in the West Bank, we came out and said, yes, boycott SodaStream. And I wrote an article about this, and I pushed back against the arguments that we were, you terrible lefties, you don't care about Palestinians and their jobs and whatever. I wrote a piece called Scarjo Settlements and the Myth of Benevolent Occupation. I'm very proud of that title. And it has stood the test of time. I recommend it. When SodaStream left the West Bank, it moved into the Negev. Now, there's lots of problems with Israeli policy in the Negev, but the Negev is not occupied territory, it is sovereign Israel. I, as someone who cares about those issues that are happening in the Negev, I work on that by supporting Israeli NGOs that are fighting bad Israeli policy in the Negev. I work with the Bedouin who are there. I have all sorts of avenues to focus on that. So when SodaStream moved to the Negev, I claimed victory and bought a SodaStream machine, which I love. Awesome machine. I have friends in the BDS movement and said, no, 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 you have to keep boycotting SodaStream. So it's hard to say that that's a victory for BDS because they don't see it as a victory until it goes further and they're still boycotting it. The main victories of the BDS movement to this point, the tangible economic business victories, are not victories for a movement that's targeting Israel. There are victories for my strategy, which targets the occupation. And that's fantastic. It proves that my strategy works. Every time the BDS claims it as a success of BDS, it helps the people in Congress who want to say there's no difference between boycotting settlements and Israel. It actually completely rebounds in a negative way against future efforts to do this. So I would say, the second part of that question actually directly validates my argument. If you focus on settlements and the occupation, you can have significant tangible victories. If you focus on Israel, I mean, if the message to a company is, well, if you get out of the settlement, but you stay in Israel, we're going to keep boycotting you. Sorry, you're not going to have a lot of, you're basically saying we're going to boycott you anyway. So why should they get out of the settlement? I say no. There's a path to positive action here.
And this question is just a yes/no question to emphasize your point. So you support boycott divestment only if it is focused on the occupation?
Personally, that is the tactic that I adopt and that I encourage people to adopt. I certainly support the right of people to do otherwise.
Yes, thank you. And I'll take a moment just to pause in terms of Churches for Middle East Peace. I mentioned previously we're neutral on the issue of BDS only because our 27 member denominations and organizations have very diverse perspectives on it. But I wanted to read a policy position which just was approved by our board this spring, which relates directly to this question of the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. So CMEP's policy position is, in order to defend free speech and religious liberty, that we uphold the right of churches and organizations to find appropriate and various ways to end unjust practices and policies that violate international laws and conventions, including exerting economic leverage on commercial and government actors. And so part of our view is we believe people absolutely should, people and organizations and institutions should have the right to engage in BDS activism, regardless of whether or not we think that is the most effective tool or tactic. So while we're neutral in that regard, we would agree with you that all people should have the right to engage in BDS activities. So this is shifting gears a bit, and I'm so terrible with acronyms, I'm having a bit of trouble translating this question, but it's mentioning Rabbi Asherman is indicating that this issue is leading the government of Israel to add banking and registration and advocacy restrictions on humanitarians. So this is shifting gears towards what Israel's response is to BDS advocates. Can this inspire all of us in the operational NGOs to stand against this type of legislation, et cetera, without being painted with the pro-BDS brush and thus therefore being in danger of being turned away at the airports?
So I'm not entirely sure I understand the question. The Israeli government is engaged in a whole range of policies and actions right now designed to delegitimize and obstruct the actions of civil society groups operating in Israel and civil society groups outside of Israel that support pro-peace, pro-human rights type agendas. That's going on separate from this legislation. I mean, this legislation I don't think is directly tied to any of this, but there's an ongoing effort here. I mean, we have, I was in Israel Palestine not that long ago. There's issues with getting visas for the people who work at these organizations on the ground. There's issues with bank accounts. There's issues, I mean, the government's trying to pass legislation further restricting their ability to raise funds and restricting their tax-exempt status. There's a whole plethora of actions being taken. This is part and parcel of the illiberal wave that is sweeping across Israel. It's also sweeping across the United States. And I think this is something where, you know, all of us, you know, the concern about whether or not you're going to get into Israel because of things you do. I mean, I don't support BDS against Israel. Under Israeli law, that's irrelevant. Israel passed long ago that basically said, for the purposes of legislation, boycotting Israel includes boycotting boycotting settlements. And I've already run afoul of Israeli law. I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to get in. And it is what it is. I'm not going to permit, for me as an American, and frankly for me as a supporter of Israel, I am not going to permit an illiberal Israeli government to tell me what I can say and do. And if people are going to start allowing that to define their activism, at that point you've already lost. You know, I hope that the Israeli government is wise enough to see that you know, emulating the policies and practices of illiberal governments around the world is not in its own interest. I think it's ironic for me as an American and a Jew who's traveled all over the world and all over the Middle East, the only country I've ever worried about getting into is Israel. You know, the only country where I worry every time I go through passport control, in or out, where I worry that my privacy, the privacy of my phone and my contacts, the dignity of my person is going to be truly in doubt. The only country I've ever faced that is Israel. And that's a terrible shame. And I say that as someone who is deeply supportive of Israel, its existence, its necessity of existence, and its security. You know, that's where we are today. And I think giving into that and restraining or reshaping our own values and our activism to try to not run afoul of illiberal policies, which, by the way, are only going to tighten, you know? So I testified at the UN Security Council about a year ago on settlements. And I mean, if you go back and read my testimony, a third of it was just framing it, beginning and end and throughout, in love of Israel and concern for Israel's security and Israel's future. And it didn't matter. I was still painted as, you know, a traitor and a capo for having talked about settlements. I'm like, what did I say that isn't true? I told facts, and the facts are out there. You know, this is not. I will not allow my voice to be silenced by people who are only going to continue to raise their demands for greater and greater silence. You don't give into it. You don't placate a bully by giving into them. You just egg them on.
I thought your speech at that Area Formula meeting against the settlements, you know, leading into when the Obama administration abstained from voting and the UN Security Council resolution acknowledging settlements as illegal, I thought that testimony was incredibly powerful. And part of what I hear you saying is, even in the midst of your advocacy and resistance that you and others, and even those who are part of the grassroots experience, part of what I hear you saying is it's worth the cost because it's the right thing to do.
I don't think you have a choice. I mean, we're at a moment in time when there is now a concerted effort by the Israeli government and by its supporters abroad to redefine the limits of acceptable speech on Israel. And to redefine, basically to say, if you are not supportive of Israel, you are anti-Semitic, you are whatever words they want to use. And they're going to redefine supportive of Israel to mean supportive of Israel and permanent occupation in the settlements. Well, I reject that redefinition of Israel. My grandfather, who was an ardent Zionist, I mean, my grandparents I mean, I found pictures. I was going through family archives and found pictures of them in Jerusalem, like, you know, a month after the '67 war. You know, just the joy of Israel's survival and being able to go into the old city and all that. I mean, this is not the Zionism that I was raised with, an expansionist, illiberal agenda. And I know there are people who will say Zionism has always been this, and you didn't understand. Look, I reject that. I mean, we'll see. I still hold on to the belief that Israel can be both a Jewish state, a state with a strong Jewish character, and a democracy. But I'll tell you, do I know that for sure? We don't know, because it's only ever been tried for a very short period, just before the '67 war. Because before that, the Arabs in Israel lived under military rule, and after that, we had the occupation. I am fighting for the chance to test the thesis, which I believe is true, which is that Israel can be a light unto the nations and can be a Jewish and democratic state. At this point, my demanding that, and that thesis now is as offensive to folks on the right in Israel as it is to the anti-Israel people who've opposed Israel since it was created in '48. That's the irony, and I'm not going to give in to either of them.
Thank you. And we probably have 3 or 4 more questions and about 10 minutes or so before we'll close. One of the things I've heard you say several times is about the liberal nature of the democratic state of Israel and the threats to that. And I think one of the things that's interesting about this legislation in American Congress, in the US political context of this Israel Anti-Boycott Act, is that there seem to be at least some conservatives who have concerns about the law as well. So for example, there was an article, I don't know if you saw it, by a gentleman who's on CMEP's leadership council. He writes for the American Conservative, and he is an ardent Republican, very conservative on many issues, and he thinks that this legislation is deeply disconcerting. So can you speak a little bit to, you know, for those who might be watching or who are interested in this conversation who would not self-identify as progressive,
Sure.
you
Sure.
know, how... Yeah.
Absolutely. Sorry, I mean to interrupt you. Look, free speech is not just for progressives and the left. Free speech is for everybody. You know, progressives are challenged in the current era to stand up for the right of people to speak on campuses and other places, people with whom we disagree perhaps deeply. And that is a challenge which we have to be up to. We have to be willing, as I said, you know, we have to defend the right of people, the right of free speech of people we disagree with, because if free speech is not protected for everybody, it is protected for nobody. This has been a challenge for the ACLU when it's defended the speech of people who, you know, are anathema to many progressives, and it's had to defend itself on why it's coming out in support of the right of this person to speak. So you know, this goes back to a question of what is a conservative and what's happened with the Republican Party and Tea Party and whatever. You know, a true conservative should be just as concerned about this free speech exception idea as I am. Again, completely separate from any issues about Israel-Palestine. They should be deeply, deeply concerned.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. This is just a very specific question about the history of the legislation. You had mentioned that there were specific laws that were put into place under the Obama administration that led into where we are today. Can you speak to those?
Sure, and I've written a ton about this. This is, unfortunately, it's just so esoteric that nobody really wants to pay attention. So there was legislation, there was language put into 2 major trade bills that the Obama administration was determined to pass. The first one was the TPA bill, which was about negotiations that are just, all this is overtaken by events. It's about a specific set of trade negotiations, and the second one is the customs bill, which actually lays down guidance for a whole range of future trade negotiations. And both of them set into law. The first one, the TPA bill, the Obama administration basically said, well, the language in it is advisory, it's not obligatory, so we're not going to worry that it's changing U.S. policy, so we'll just sign this bill and ignore it and not say anything about it. When it came up in the customs bill, where it essentially laid out that for future U.S. trade negotiations, the single top priority that negotiators, that's specified in the bill that negotiators must fight for, is against any measures that penalize, that boycott Israel, with boycotting Israel defined to mean Israel and territories under Israeli control. So it's the conflation. That passed into law. The president signed it, we knew he would. It was a key trade bill that he wanted to pass into law. The Obama administration issued a signing statement saying that this was not consistent with U.S. policy and they were going to ignore it. This is something that presidents every president has used signing statements. Signing statements, by the way, are certainly not binding on subsequent subsequent administrations. So certainly the Trump administration could choose to ignore that signing statement because it is now effective. It is now law that for trade negotiations, our negotiators must go in there as defenders and advocates of the Israeli settlement movement. That's done. And by the way, as I said, I talked about that, like those layers, how people build upon previous legislation. So now when we see legislation introduced at the state level, where they're talking about limiting the rights to get contracts at the state level if you boycott Israel, you see this piece of what is now settled law referenced. You see this exact, definition by boycott settlements in Israel. Sometimes they spell it out, and sometimes it says the meaning given in, and they reference the customs bill. So.
This is a related question in terms of the current legislation, the way it's proposed, being in violation to international law. So it says, given that the bills conflate Israel with settlements in the occupied Palestinian territories, which are unlawful under international law, what obligations does the U.S. have to not recognize or assist in this illegal situation?
So, look, I mean, in some ways, well, it's very, very clear. Under international law, the settlements are illegal. You can, it's one of those things where people who are proponents of the settlements, apologists, advocates, they have one or two legal authorities, legal scholars that they can find who will say, no, you're misreading the law. That's not what it means. That's one or two. And then every single other authority since 1967, including authorities within the Israeli government. There's wonderful documents being dredged up from the Israeli archives now by an organization called Akevot in Israel, which dives through the archives. Everybody else agrees, no. This is in violation of international law. But it's clearly never been a pillar of U.S. policy vis-a-vis settlements that international law has always been irrelevant. We have framed our policy on settlements in terms of not helpful, not conducive to peace, undermining the two-state solution, hurting confidence, yada, yada, yada. And frankly, where we are today with international law being reasserted in the Israeli-Palestinian context is a direct result of the failure of the peace process. So I've been working on this file since basically Oslo. I came into this right around the time of Oslo. And since Oslo, since 1993 or so, the entire international community has been pretty happy to say, look, yes, international law, yada, 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 but we have a peace process. So we're not going to spend a lot of energy focusing on the international law stuff, because if we can just get to a peace agreement, it'll settle everything. So let's not get bogged down in these arguments about what's legal and what isn't. The failure of the peace process, the discrediting of the idea of a negotiated two-state solution, we're now in like a decade where it's not serious, has led the international community outside of the US, certainly Europe, to say, okay, if the peace process is going to tie this all up, we're going to go back and focus on the international law elements of it. Not unlike the Palestinian activists and many of us who are increasingly saying, okay, I still support the two-state solution. Me, Lara Friedman, I still believe it's the only way to end this conflict. But right now, I do not believe that working to restart a peace process has any credibility at all. And I think talking about working for Palestinian rights and for implementation of international law is really the only credible thing you can do right now.
Well, and as we come to a close, I mean, you've talked a bit in this conversation about the efficacy of grassroots engagement and how part of, the withdrawal of certain members of Congress for their support on this legislation has been because of grassroots activism. Is your sense that there's still room, CNEP has an action alert, we're calling people to contact their members of Congress. Is that something we should really be pushing right now in terms of educating, our members about these concerns? You talk to us a bit about how people should respond.
Look, I don't think this is going anywhere. And I mean, we're always kind of trying to figure out when is the best time to weigh in. And in my previous life at Peace Now, this is something I thought about a lot. I'm not currently in an advocacy organization, so it's not quite the same stuff. But in terms of giving advice, this is very much a live issue. Again, AIPAC put out an action alert yesterday urging its activists to contact members of Congress in support of this legislation. And by the way, sending all of them the article written by the Anti-Defamation League and a guy named Stu Eisenstadt, Jonathan Greenblatt and Stu Eisenstadt. So they're not laying off on this. I think this is one of those things, you know, much like anything else in Congress where there's a lot of will to move it, you don't get to relax. You don't get to declare victory. I believe this is going to end up being amended, and they're going to end up trying to move it quickly and say, listen, we fixed it. You lefties, you're never happy. It's really important that people keep on this. And this needs to be truly a teachable moment for members of Congress, because even if this passes, it's not the last thing. There will be more. And if this doesn't pass, this is not the last thing. There will be more. And there's going to be more at the state level. These are pending constantly at the state level. The message needs to be gotten to the members of Congress, state and federal, from their constituents. Do not just sign on to anything that says BDS, assuming that this is something that is not controversial. And do not believe people when they tell you, oh, this is easy, and if you oppose it, that means you're anti-Israel. There are many of us who are deeply supportive of Israel who strongly oppose this. This is not a pro-Israel move. This is a pro-settlements, pro-greater Israel legislation. And if members want to support that, they should own it. They should say, you know what, I'm supporting this because I don't support the two-state solution. I think Israel should rule from the river to the sea, et cetera, et cetera. Let them own that position. At the very least, members need to be called out. And if they say that they that they are also people who support free speech, they need to be challenged. This is not, that you cannot say you support the free speech of Americans and still support this. You can't.
Well, and I would encourage people watching, Churches for Middle East Peace has an active action alert right now, which is seeking to educate our members of Congress about the things we've been talking about in terms of our concerns of this legislation, the conflation of the West Bank with Israel proper, the concerns about free speech. This will be the last question, Laura, and it's a follow-up to that. With the growing momentum we're seeing in Congress on the Israel anti-boycott bills, should we start thinking about challenging this legislation in court if this is passed?
I mean, look, I suspect folks at the ACLU are certainly thinking about that. I think all the energy right now has to be in trying to fight it. And if it passes, it'll move to the courts. I mean, I think we're soon going to start seeing court challenges to the state legislation for some of this. I mean, this has been passed in many, many states, brazenly unconstitutional. So, I mean, I think that'll happen. I wouldn't give up on stopping this. I think it is possible to stop this very hard. I think if it's not going to be stopped, this needs to be, if this passes, it must pass at a very, very high cost, which tells members, hey, this was not easy. You don't want to get into this again. And by the way, you are being lied to by the advocates of this bill. They are humiliating you. If I were the staff of some of the offices that are on board as co-sponsors of this bill, or some of the early sponsors of the bill, I would be outraged at the lobbyists who came in and sold me this bill of goods. Because now I, means progressive Democrats, and am having to come out with positions that are ludicrous and they're indefensible politically because they were lied to about what this bill said. I have much more respect for the Republicans, some of the far right-wing Republicans who are saying, essentially, I don't support the two-state solution, so of course I support this. That's honest. I welcome and cherish that honesty. Then we can at least have a real debate about it.
Well, thank you. Our hour has come to an end. I'd encourage people to go, as you've mentioned, to the Foundations for Middle East Peace, fmep.org. Laura's website of the organization she leads, and also Churches for Middle East Peace, www.cmep.org. This conversation will be shared on YouTube. We'll send it out, make it available. We'll send people, also those who registered, links to the legislation and to the article that Laura mentioned. So thank you for being here with us. Really appreciate it, Laura, and hope that this will be a good step in terms of people better understanding what some of the core concerns are.
Thank you, May. It's a pleasure being here, and thanks to CMEP for the great work that you do.
Thank you.